Hi again, and welcome to another episode of the Government Transformation Show, the podcast for public sector changemakers. I'm Tim Coulthard, Community Director at Government Transformation Magazine. Today, I'm joined by Nick Streatfeild, who is Managing Director at GovMetric. We're going to explore the changing nature of citizen experience, how public services are changing the way they have to be delivered in order to respond to changing demand from those users. Some organizations are making a great job of this, others lagging behind a bit. So we're going to explore that with Nick and try and understand how organizations can be better at measuring the impact of and effectiveness of their public services. How many interactions do they have on a monthly basis? How can they manage demand? How can they anticipate demand? Big questions which, if they're built right into the public service strategy, can be transformational in terms of those outcomes. Lots to jump into, so let's get into the conversation with Nick right now. So Nick, welcome to the Government Transformation Show. Great to have you joining us today for the conversation.
Thank you very much, Tim.
I'm looking forward to drilling into what is a highly relevant topic right now, which is, I guess, the ongoing journey of citizen experience versus customer experience, how organizations in the public sector are maybe rethinking their relationships and how that plays through in how they design and execute services, how they collect data, how they act on that data, that whole kind of journey and cycle. So there's a lot going on there. So before we jump into that, because I know there's lots to say there, just let's set the scene a bit. I'd really like to hear a bit about your sort of journey through the public sector, how you've been working with different public sector organizations over the years. Way back when you started out, not implying that you've been around too long, but you've certainly had a depth of experience there, and I guess you've seen some of the changes that have happened. So let's set the scene. Tell us a bit about your story through the public sector.
So about 25, 26 years old. That's the company, not me, obviously. We started in the mid-90s, and interestingly, we were really kicked off as a community project. So there was no company structure or business plan. It was, this is the web, this looks interesting, this could apply to a community and all aspects of the community, and that really was what drove us. So we started a community portal for Rutland in the Midlands, and that was really to exploit the emerging web technologies, the potential it had in terms of communication, but also in terms of democratic engagement and so on and so forth. So that very quickly led us into a relationship with the council. Obviously, if somebody on your doorstep is doing that stuff, then the council gets interested.
Yeah.
And that was a fantastic relationship. We and Rutland County Council sort of formed a bit of a joint venture. They went off and got some funding from the Regional Development Agency. That involved then getting staff. And the objective was really to bring together a sort of public-private delivery of services to a locality through the same medium, through the same window. That surprisingly won Local Government Website of the Year in 2000, which none of us even knew we'd been entered for. So,
how many were there at that point? One of the questions I suppose you might ask. I'd love. I mean, what was a sort of late 90s, early noughties public sector portal? What was on it at the time? Can you even remember?
Well, interestingly, there were lots of aspects of it which are common today. So we had a map, obviously, on the front page because we are a county. We had lists of services, both from the private sector and also the public sector and the community sector, obviously. And then we had the very embryonic stages of sort of user-generated content, so forums, all of the challenges of running that as well, which obviously the Facebooks and co have found out later on down the line. We had all of that in a microcosm back in sort of late 90s. But Rutland's always had a strong identity as well, so there was very strong support, and it really allowed us to get things up and running very quickly.
Gotcha.
So that sort of 2000, that's when the whole of the e-government program started, and of course we were therefore sitting at that table, and the next challenge was, okay, how do we get all of these services connected through this medium? So that involved a lot of integration and working with back office system providers and And along the way, the whole sort of e-government program, which ran to about 2005, eventually became much more sort of grown up and formal. So we had to drop the community portal aspect because obviously .gov.uk sites took precedence, and which was unfortunate, but you know, that was the way the direction was going. At the end of the e-government program, 2005-06, we were sitting there thinking, well, what are we going to do now? And you know, having been part of that journey, it was quite apparent that all of the infrastructure had been put in place, you know, CRM, CMS, you know, you name it, telephony systems, but there was no mention of what was the impact of this on the customer, on the citizen. Right at the end of that programme, the Cabinet Office released the e-service delivery standards, and they were invaluable. That's, you know, it sort of had to happen then. It would have been better if it happened at the beginning, but, you know, you don't know until you do. So, and we took the customer service e-service delivery standard and thought, well, that's exactly what we need. That's what's needed. So still having very strong connections with the LGA, the local LGA. They helped us bring together a group of about 6 councils in the East Midlands, county unitary districts, so a good mix as well. And we set about looking at the e-service delivery standards and planning what you would need to measure that on behalf of the citizens' experience. And that led to a prototype of GovMetric, and the 15 or 16 years since then have been an evolution of that agenda in public service provision.
Yeah. So given you've been on almost every step of that journey, from the sort of most nascent sort of online services and interactions all the way through to where we are now, where things are more sophisticated, there's much more functionality, people's expectations change. What are the big changes that you've seen during that period? I suppose there's 2 aspects to this. There's how organizations themselves view and respond to the needs of their citizens. And then there's also the changing expectations and demands of the citizens themselves. And actually the relative importance and prioritization of those 2 aspects. There's a slider there, which is, well, it's about us and what we're doing in our processes versus actually whatever we need to do to make the outcome improvement for the citizen. So what are the big sort of themes that you've seen emerge during that time, and what do they mean as we head to the present day?
So certainly citizen or customer expectations are continually growing. You know, the competitive marketplace has responded very, very well over the last couple of decades in terms of how digital can enable people to receive better services and you know, wider choice and better pricing, and, you know, all of these things we've enjoyed from digital improvement. So you know, of course, public service has to try and keep up with that, because, you know, somebody that uses a service from Amazon is also somebody that uses a service from a public service provider. So that's been a growing expectation. The sector itself has obviously been through big changes. You know, there was, you know, go back to 06, that was a Labour government. It was a fairly buoyant economy. We then go into, you know, a financial crash. We go into a change of government. We go into austerity. You know, the way public service has picked its way through that has been complex and challenging. What we've really seen over the last few years, though, is a real hardening and strengthening of you know, why you should do this sort of thing. You know, 15 years ago, to be quite honest, some of the people we work with didn't know why they were doing what they were doing. Right. You know, it seemed a good idea, and it is a good idea. You know, you can't argue against that. But there was no business case. There was little strategic adoption or engagement. You know, it was customer service. It was usually customer service manager driven, you know, team leader driven, you know, very sort of middle management operational type thing. What we've really seen in the last few years is a more strategic sort of executive, and potentially in some areas political engagement as well. So, understanding that, not only understanding that it's a good thing to provide good services to people, but in doing that, you might actually save yourself some money as well.
Yeah.
The cost, there's nothing more costly than doing a service badly.
Yeah, and I think we'll certainly probably come on to that, won't we? So we're in 2022. There's not a one size fits all approach, and there's also not one sort of level of maturity and sort of capability across local governments across the UK. If we're marking the homework of local authorities in terms of how well they've incorporated the citizen requirements, citizen demands, and responded to that in the way they design and execute services, is it good picture, patchy? What would you say in terms of that current capability?
I think that it's a very wide range of experiences. We're certainly seeing some excellent practice. We're also seeing, some quite acute and chronic failure as well. I think the whole issue of demand, I'm becoming increasingly fascinated by. If you take citizen experience and sort of deconstruct that, then you've got the voice of the customer, voice of the citizen, which is obviously important. Each and every time they interact with you, what's their experience? The other participant in that is usually an employee. So you've got the voice of the employee, frontline customer services, or grassroots service delivery. So you've got that voice of employee element. Increasingly, we're seeing behaviour data being brought into that mix. So you've got how does somebody work their way through a website, or you've got observation of how somebody tries to do something, and that can be analog channels as well as digital channels. So that's really important, the behavioural data bit. And then the bit that I'm really interested in at the moment is the demand data bit, because if you take primary care, primary health, for example, surgeries, we're starting to see a very acute situation developing in surgeries for length and breadth of the country. There's been 2 years worth of suppressed demand. You had an ingrown toenail, you put up with it rather than go to the surgery. All of that is now, that damn
corks out the bottle, and here we go. Yeah,
corks out the bottle. At the same time as that, we've got demand increasing anyway, because cost of living crisis and a whole range of other factors. So we're seeing acute demand increases, and it's very tempting when something like that happens to just sort of pull the first lever you see. It's blimey, this is happening, what are we going to do? People want to see some sort of response. But those people that work through methodologies such as systems thinking, lean, you've got to understand what's going on in the system. So in the CX equation, which is voice of the customer, voice of the employee, behavior data, demand data, then I think demand data is definitely an area that's needing a lot of attention at the moment, at the same time as the CX bit. If you then expand that into CITX, because obviously public service delivery is different, then as well as that sort of complex supplier customer relationship, you've also got the other elements of what being a citizen means. So we've got the whole democratic relationship, and how does that feature in a citizen relationship. We've also got the community relationship. We are each one of us individual citizens, but collectively we are a community. So I think you can deconstruct citizen experience into several elements which are the same as CX, some other which are peculiar to citizen. And then when you look at all of those as a sort of a composite holistic view, then you need to start drilling into the individual bits, and the demand bit is probably the bit that's going to demand our attention most acutely. over the coming months and years, actually.
Yeah, and I want to kind of explore that demand, sort of management demand understanding in a bit more detail. There's just a point actually that's interesting to explore. It's not just about terminology, because I think it's about philosophy and approach, which is around the distinction that you've just alluded to around citizen experience versus sort of traditional thinking around customer experience. And people throw the term CX around, and some people clarify what they mean and some people don't. You know, we run an event called the Citizen Experience Show, but there are references to customer experience, but very often in terms of public services, it's not a true customer experience because there's no element of choice. They haven't got another council to go to. They can't go to, you know, you live in Essex, you can't go, actually, no, I'll go and engage with Hertfordshire instead because I like the way they do things. You know, you are where you are. There's not that sort of true element of choice that customer and consumer implies. So has that sort of, it's not a theological debate because it's a real thing. So how have organizations kind of, has the penny dropped in understanding that because of the situation they're in, because that it's this citizen relationship, which is different to consumer and commercial company, that they need to sort of retool their thinking and then retool how they respond?
I think what you're hitting on there as well is the nature of the supplier. So again, in a competitive marketplace, suppliers usually tune themselves to a great degree of finesse in terms of who they're targeting and what they're selling and how they then process that. If you look at public service organisations, they're extremely complex. So, you know, there is a wrapper that is put round that says you are responsible for these various things, which may or may not actually fit together very well. But that is the situation we are in, so that's what we have to deal with. So you've got complex organisations, you've got complex services as well. You know, you've got everything from, you know, complex adult social care type services, children's services, right through to the classic bin, you know, and emptying a bin, which is pretty transactional and should be quite simple. There shouldn't be much variation in that service. It should be quite straightforward. And the other thing you've got is complex customers, you know, because you've got some people that just don't want to deal with the council or, you know, the service provider, unless they really, really have to, because they don't have a need. And then you've got people that could consume several services. And actually, during your life, you move through a whole spectrum of service consumption. So, you know, young families, middle-aged, empty nesters, people living up their own, you know, on their own at an elderly age, all have different service demands. So I think in public service providers, it is really important to acknowledge that and not compensate for it, because that wouldn't be the right approach, but to acknowledge it and to work with it, you know, to try and provide joined up services. But it is really, really challenging. I've never come across organisations as challenging as public service providers, and particularly councils, actually, because they've just got so much that's wrapped in together. So I think that's you know, that's a particular challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the element of understanding demand, I suppose the initial question is how can organizations get better at that, rather than as you say, reacting, pulling, grabbing levers when they suddenly realize that there's a demand for services that they hadn't anticipated. So sort of seeing what's coming down the track, rather than just sort of knee-jerking as and when things change. How do they sort of start to build that more planned, coherent approach?
So this is where we're starting to see some real progress. So in housing, we've worked with some organisations in the last year or so who are starting to develop quite strong methods and understanding of that holistic picture. And you know, again, there's a whole wide range of services within housing. You know, it's a wide spectrum, but to a certain degree, there's enablement facilitating this. So you've got technical enablement in that there are now readily affordable tools available. You know, the BI tools that are very accessible in the marketplace. You've also got a range of sort of citizen scientists, and I mean by that I mean, you know, people within the organisation who have access or knowledge or an appetite to start building those sorts of data sets. So we are starting to see that, but it's definitely emerging on a organisation by organisation basis. And I think there is some potential to start developing some sort of widespread methodology, you know, but sort of by the sector, for the sector methodology in terms of how we measure demand. There's great work being done by people like Vanguard, you know, in the systems thinking in terms of the Vanguard method, and, you know, understand demand, do that first before you do anything else, study the system. So, you know, frequency, type, is it simple, is it complex, is there much variation, you know, is it value, is it failure, you know, really starting to try and understand that, because I don't think it's until you really understand how much demand is hitting you right across the organisation that you really can start to deploy your resources or to make interventions which can make an impact. But the risk is, like I said earlier, you pull a lever and actually it fixes a small problem over here, but it actually creates a much bigger problem over there.
Yeah, and actually that reflects some of the conversations that we have with local government CIOs and CDOs and so on, which is they're now trying to sort of wrap their arms around all these sort of service lines they've got running. You know, Camden, I know, have about 600 plus business service lines running. And then can you build the sort of culture and systems and processes where you can start to layer those up and build out meaningful insights, not just in service A, service B, service C, but how service A, B, and C interact. What are the common threads that mean people need all of those services and all that sort of stuff. And so I suppose a process by which we can support all organizations in doing the same, irrespective of their circumstances, what kind of territories and socioeconomic factors they've got playing out, then that, I suppose, has got to be a sort of end goal that the public sector works towards. So what are you seeing in terms of that collaboration right now? Is it happening, or is it still sort of pockets of isolation?
Again, a bit of both. So we are seeing some collaboration. I think you know, in certain sectors, you obviously have policy coming down from on high. Increasingly, that policy is being considered at a sort of a systemic or holistic level. So that provides some consistency in terms of what the method that organisations on the ground might adopt and work towards. There are also, you know, in the world of CX, of which CITEX is a strand, there's now a lot of method and you know, frameworks that you can work towards. You know, all of that hard work has been done. You know, we for some years have been tuned into some of Forrester's work around the maturity of the CX maturity model, and, you know, foundational, advanced, systemic, state of the art. You know, those frameworks propose methodologies. Those methodologies can be sort of consumed relatively simply. The big bit that's been missing in the last few years, though, is that sort of strategic understanding of what value this has. As I said, it's more often than not, it is still being driven from the middle. And that is great, because you've got champions and you've got passion and you've got, you know, all of that stuff, good stuff going on. But the strategic engagement at the sort of the executive level is still very much in pockets. We have got customers that, you know, where that's happening. So National Highways, for example, you know, they've got an executive driven project called Echo. Every customer has an opinion. So, you know, that's systemic across the organisation. We've also got one of the councils that joined us in the previous show is Wokingham. You know, they are most certainly developing a strategic element of CITEX in their overall strategy.
Yeah.
And we've got other councils we're working with who see that and are jealous.
Yeah.
Because they're still at that sort of middle operational level. So one of the things that we talked about actually at the last session was a project we're kicking off this year, which is a open and free to join program, which is looking to bring together some of those parties to start building the business case for CITEX, so that organisations can learn from each other. They can see what's working, what's not working, and obviously there's always power in numbers as well. So if we've got 3 or 4 really strong citizen experience or customer insight or transformation director level people sharing those experiences, it really gives them a lever to take back to their executive and say, this is really the way we should be going. This is the direction we should be going.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that it almost comes down to that sort of fear of missing out mentality. If that's the button you need to push with your executive leadership team, then push that button by all means. And I think with the collaboration piece, we talked earlier about how fundamentally citizen experience isn't the same as customer experience because they're not transacting in the same way. They don't have the element of choice. But the upside of that is that obviously different local government organizations aren't in competition with each other. So therefore, collaboration, sharing best practice is the way to go.
I was only on a call yesterday afternoon with a consultancy that works in housing, and we were both just saying how good it was to work in a sector where people are willing to share. And that goes right across the public service spectrum. And we have to, because at the end of the day, a single citizen is consuming services from all of us. In a geographic locality, they'll be interacting with several public service providers. So we've got to share to learn from each other, and we've got to share to better service that citizen. And that's where open standards, open data, interoperability, these big global themes have so much more to deliver to the public service than they do to the private sector. Because we can fully consume those and eat them all up, and then share more that you wouldn't do in the private sector because it's a competitive environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's next for that? You mentioned you'll bring them together through a forum. What stage are you at now, and what are the next steps for that? Because I'm sure people listening would think this sounds interesting. So how can people get involved?
We're going to be kicking that off over the next probably 4 to 6 weeks. We've still got some places left. So if anybody's interested in what we've been talking about, we'd love to hear from you. It's going to be practical. So we're going to try and work up some models that people can pull apart and say, well, yeah, that bit worked. So that if we're asked the question, how many interactions did you handle last month, we can answer it. Because I've never met a chief exec of a public service provider yet who can tell me exactly how many interactions they did last month. And in a world where demand is changing, we're in a very volatile environment on demand. We've absolutely got to have a handle on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it sounds like there's good things happening. There's certainly lots of room for improvement, of course, but I think that spirit of collaboration, that's starting to sort of bottom out the numbers, making sure that we're talking about robust methodology, making sure that everybody's kind of measuring in the same way. At least then you quantify the issue, you quantify the level of the challenge, and then you can start to develop kind of solutions based on reality, not perception or whatever it might be. So that can only be a good thing. So great to hear that's going on. It's been great to sort of cover some of these ideas around demand management, around failure demand, around citizen experience versus customer experience. So really interesting to get through to that. So Nick, all I want to say now is thanks for joining us. We'll put some information about how people can get in touch if they want to get involved in the forum, in all the info accompanying the episode, because I think that, the more people that are sharing experiences, sharing best practice, the better. So great to support that. But in the meantime, just remains me to say thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us.
Pleasure. So thanks again to Nick Streatfeild from GovMetric for that conversation. Great to hear how the evolution of citizen experience is playing out, how organizations are responding, and what they can do to make a better job of understanding demand, understanding how their citizens want to engage with their services, and make improvements off the back of that. I'm going to put the information to the forum that Nick talked about in the show notes accompanying this. So if you're interested in getting involved with that, you can get in touch, get involved in that project, start sharing best practice and learning from your peers. That's about it for now, but we'll be back soon with another conversation with a public sector changemaker. Until then, goodbye.